justice, equity, inclusion, and diversity. So I'm really excited to be in community with you all. And just to get some preliminary tools on how to engage in restorative practices, restorative justice foundations, just to get some of the balls rolling. Just also to hear some of what I've learned in kind of coordinating and facilitating restorative justice and restorative practices in our communities. So we'll go ahead and get started, right? Can we?
Yep, go for it.
Okay, cool. Let's go for it. So I just want to start off by doing a little land and work acknowledgement. So I'm going to read this out to folks to allow us to be in community to acknowledge the traditional ancestral territory we are all occupying. I myself am facilitating this training in the nations of the Tongva and the Chumash people. I also want to uplift, celebrate, and provide verbal gratitude for the work Indigenous and Native people cultivated in the conception and practice of restorative justice. We all have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible our relationships to Native people and their contributions to our collective work. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge the work restorative justice practitioners have cultivated. And I want to uplift the work, especially of my femtors at UC Berkeley specifically, who have supported my leadership development in restorative justice facilitation and how that intersects with survivor support, advocacy, and prevention education. Just wanted to name that as we get started. And for any folks that are interested in seeing what territory you are currently on, I invite you to go to nativeland.california or CA, just to kind of get a visualization of a map of kind of what territory you're currently on. All right, let's go ahead. So, as I mentioned, restorative justice's values, principles, and practices are all rooted in ancient practices of many cultures, including African, First Nation, Canadian, Pacific Islander, and other Native and indigenous peoples. So, for example, the Abenaki people have a tradition of sitting in a circle and passing a talking piece to focus on the speaker. I also want to name that restorative justice has been in some way appropriated as an alternative resolution process and oftentimes has been institutionalized. But as we know, communities have strengthened their communities far before these institutions have utilized these processes. So we just wanted to name that reality as we, again, continue on through the session. Okay, so here I would like to kind of center and ground us in our work and in our conversations today. So I invite you all to think about what brings you here in this moment, what leads you to want to learn more about restorative justice and restorative practice. For me, it unfortunately comes with a lot of workplace trauma, memories of being a younger person in this field, and ideas that one is not experienced, being talked over, ideas often ignored, disregarding personal holistic safety, rigid ideas of who survivors are or what type of support that they need. So I just want to give you all like a moment to ground any struggle, resilience, eagerness to explore restorative practice for a second. And feel free to write them in the chat if you feel yourself wanting to do that. Just like a second. Okay. Thanks, y'all, for sitting in that moment with me. Okay, so the word intersectionality. So intersectionality has become this buzzword, and I'm starting to feel like in a lot of social justice oriented spaces is becoming one of those cliche terms that people just kind of throw around. And I know that many folks in this space have heard the term before and knows and are fully aware of the concept. But I do think it's also important to mansplain a little bit because I've heard many folks, ironically mostly men, and masculine folks mischaracterize it. I actually think one of the most hilarious explanations that I've heard is that intersectionality comes from um, or is about Black women lawyers, which was wild. And so I just want to explain a little bit more context about where and what intersectionality is. So essentially, it is a framework that allows us to understand our different identities that are disenfranchised or underrepresented or minoritized that are connecting at the same time. And so this actually phenomena is was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, a law professor in actually at Columbia University and UCLA. And it actually comes from one of her court cases where her clients were Black women. And they were attempting to argue that the that they were being um, discriminated against on the basis of pay um, because of their race and their sex. And the opposing side was trying to argue, well, no, because we have Black men that are making X amount of money. We have white women that are making X amount of money. So we are not discriminating based off of race or gender or sex because of these examples. And so what Kimberly Crenshaw was trying to argue was that they were experiencing discrimination on both of those things at the same time. And so that is where the term intersectionality comes from. So again, it's not just all of our identities intersecting, it's specifically the ones that are disenfranchised or minoritized. Um, and so I also just wanted to take a moment to flex a little bit and share a picture that I got to take with Kimberly Crenshaw when I was in undergrad in maybe like 2016, 2017. It was a great workshop. And yeah, again, I just wanted to flex and be like, I met one of my heroes, or Shiros. So again, just wanted to really emphasize the intention and significance of intersectionality, but as we are engaging in and practicing and uplifting intersectionality, that we are not misappropriating or mischaracterizing what the intention is for. All right. So bubbles are a double-edged sword. They can be empowering, validating, and they really give us the ability to feel like we can be our authentic selves within our community. And I alluded to this earlier, but one way that I like to describe this as being an undergraduate student, excuse me, I'm being surrounded with a lot of progressive thought and social justice oriented thinking. And then I started working in South Orange County. And you can imagine the culture shock that I experienced when I learned that this bubble left me to feel naive to the realities that also exist outside of these silos, outside of the higher ed silo. It was wild out there. And so right now I'm working in higher ed at Occidental College, like I mentioned earlier, which is a liberal arts college, which is honestly a bubble inside of already the higher ed bubble. And like I mentioned, again, these bubbles can feel or offer safety, grounding, community to help us recharge when we get exposed to any stressors that exist beyond our bubbles. And while this reality is true, it's also true that sometimes these bubbles create misperceptions of the realities that exist beyond. So, not all communities have had the opportunity to think about alternative resolution processes or think about how survivors are not a monolith, that all want the person that caused harm to be incarcerated. Not all people have the language to think about people beyond the word perpetrators, which vilifies and strips the humanity of people when we call them perpetrators. And I think sometimes that these bubbles also give us less exposure and less grace in the people unlearning or thinking beyond harmful traditional social norms. And I keep thinking about or keep talking about my undergraduate experience, but I'm going to do it again. But I was in my first class that exposed me to the concept of feminism. And so I was there, naive, problematic, young Andrew was in this class, and they were talking about the different waves of feminism. And as I was there, I remember thinking that I had the most like intellectually complex thoughts. And I was like, hey, why are we talking about feminism? Isn't the point to be treated equally? Are we not doing that? Like, we're not doing that in this space, so we're not like actually practicing equality. It was so dumb at the time. And I shared that thinking that it was the coolest thing that I thought I ate. But then folks in the class, they ate me up. They invited me into a conversation where they were very critical, but also like invited me to think about things in a new perspective. Um, And it challenged me and it encouraged me to seek more information, to get involved into different things on campus and get in, like learn from different mentors and femtors that were in my community and offered me that grace that honestly might be a little bit more challenging now. I think a lot of times folks feel afraid or fear of saying the wrong thing. Um, but in that moment, I was offered that grace to be able to unlearn and get the opportunity to relearn something. And that was really helpful in my own thought process. So if the folks in that classroom didn't offer me the opportunity to unlearn, I wouldn't have been able to continue to unlearn, right? So in summary, bubbles are rejuvenating, but we shouldn't allow these bubbles give, or we shouldn't allow these bubbles to fully exile folks just because it's uncomfortable to go outside of our bubble, right? So I invite you to think about what bubbles we're currently in. Are we in a bubble of our organization? And it could be good or bad, right? Maybe we're not thinking about things in a more social justice oriented lens. Maybe we're thinking about things in a really specific lens that is carceral or very punitive and not restorative. And I invite folks to think about what it is like outside of this bubble that makes us feel safe. Um, but I invite us to challenge our perspectives. All right. So when we think about restorative justice or restorative practices, we often think about it being something that has to happen after harm happens. But we can create a foundation in our institutions or in our communities that have resources and tools that they need before harm happens. So I like to say that restorative justice is also prevention. And I'll explain a little bit more and give a little bit more details as to why that's the case. Restorative justice is also a long process. It takes a lot of time and investment to build vulnerability and connection to people in the community. And we can take advantage of that truth through implementing long-term sustainable programs that continuously build on that community trust and vulnerability within communities. We can't just rely on restorative justice to engage in secondary prevention, for example, like hosting like a conflict circle. We can't do that if that foundational structure and commitment to fostering community is not already established. It's like we're working backwards. Um, Restorative justice has also been incorporated by many institutions as an alternative resolution process. And while those intentions that are made are intended to be anti-carceral, we should also be really vigilant about the accessibility in this process. Excuse me. So for example, I mentioned earlier that like a lot of my background is in higher ed. Um, and restorative justice across the board is not necessarily seen as a confidential process. So, for example, so if victims or survivors are looking for alternative modes of accountability and justice, many times and in many instances, there needs to be a report to these incidences. So, like, for example, when I was doing restorative justice facilitation at UC Berkeley, the care office or the office that offers like sexual assault victim services and prevention education, while that resource was confidential, restorative justice wasn't embedded at UC Berkeley. There was a restorative justice office, but if someone were to go looking for restorative justice services, that would need to get reported, especially if there's a protected category. So if someone was the victim, a survivor of domestic violence, of sexual assault, that would need to be filed because the employees at the restorative justice office were responsible employees, thus not necessarily being survivor centered because in many instances survivors want to have a confidential process, want to have autonomy over that reporting process, want to engage in restorative justice as an alternative resolution process. But if that if it if a report needs to be made, then is it truly survivor centered? So this process should also be realistic and sustainable. So for many institutions, also there's not a lot of bandwidth for staff to incorporate restorative process or to facilitate restorative justice circles. But we can totally create some tools and resources so that students or community members can facilitate restorative justice practices or circles on their own. And there's still a lot of work to do in this field in terms of uplifting the work that amazing femmes, queer, trans folks, and Black, Indigenous people of color have pioneered. But at the same time, I think there's also a need to refrain how to inform, educate, and empower communities to unlearn harmful social norms. So by utilizing restorative justice practices, that also recognizes that not all flowers bloom at the same rate. Sometimes people say the wrong things. Sometimes someone will ask an inappropriate question, or engage in exclusionary behaviors, but the response shouldn't be always to exile that person. All people are deserving of learning and growing so that future harm doesn't continue to happen. And the woke Olympics does not serve to contribute to structural change. In my opinion, it prolongs it by really making it inaccessible and scary and intimidating to have a conversation with someone because they're afraid of, again, we've really glorified this idea of penalization and so it can be really scary for someone to engage in meaningful dialogue because they don't want to get canceled or they don't want um, to be seen as someone who is racist, who is homophobic. Um, People can obviously say those things and cause harm and make people experience discomfort. But again, we need to allow folks to or approach with grace so that this person understands why those things are the case. And it's a both and. That's a reality. And also people, it's hard for people not to feel a defensiveness when they hear something like those words were problematic and not hear you are problematic. Right. Okay. So something else that I'm experiencing in being in higher ed, and I think this is true for some local organizations as well, is that we often operate in a chronic sense of urgency. So something happens, chaos ensues, and we don't give enough time to process or and be reactive with something and be overly reactive. And that's not to say that we shouldn't be responsive in crisis, but I think it's okay not to do something immediately because we might cause more harm. So, for example, I think there's a lot of energy currently on how to navigate geopolitical US politics. And, folks, I think this is my opinion, I think that folks do want to engage in these topics. And I think people think that they are ready to engage in these topics. But sometimes I don't know if people have the tools or if folks have the tools to be able to engage in these conversations in meaningful, productive, non-vilifying, non-antagonistic ways. Um, Again, multiple realities can be true at the exact same time. Okay. So going back to what I alluded to earlier about making social norms change in domestic violence prevention, there is a norm we should be challenging ourselves to disrupt, which is this punitive response mindset. So punitive responses being often centered around what rule was broken, who broke the rule, what should the punishment be. There's this reliance on a written word. Only breaches in policy matter. But not necessarily breaches in boundaries, personal safety, fully holistic experiences. It's just like right versus wrong. And in a punitive response, usually it means we want punishment for the person who harmed. It also assumes that people who cause harm are inherently bad and also deserve harm. That justice is done when there's a replication of harm, when harm is also done to the person who caused harm. Punitive responses are also centering the person who caused harm. It dehumanizes them. It removes any sort of complexity that exists within the human experiences. And so when we instead use a more restorative response, we're asking questions around what was the harm that happened? What are the needs of the person? What are the needs of the community after said thing happened? Who is obligated in this conversation? Who are the facilitators? Who are the key people or the practitioners that can help heal this community? When we use a restorative response, we're focusing on the needs of every single person that's involved. Obviously, we want to center the person who directly experienced the harm, but as we know, when we are adjacent to the experience of that kind of like fractured a community, there's multiple entities that are involved. Restorative responses also seek to change behavior and understanding to prevent future actions. So if we're only like suspending someone, if we're only excluding people from communities, if we're only throwing them into jail, it doesn't allow for meaningful change in behaviors or mindsets or beliefs. It also centers the person who was harmed when we're using a restorative practice. If we're only focusing on the person who caused harm, it's not really being survivor centered. Um, Restorative responses are also intent and impact discussions, right? So obviously context is important. It's always important to be mindful of where the intention is coming from, but ultimately we know that impact also matters. Um, Gaining an insight on what nuanced and unique needs of the person who experienced harm are. Every single person's different. Every single person is going to have a different way on how they define what accountability means to them. And so when we strip that away from a survivor or someone who caused harm, it's just not survivor centered. So again, restorative practices understands that many times that in many times or many cases, multiple people are also impacted. Hmm, Spoilers, put too far ahead. Okay. I want to give a content warning for this slide in particular, so please take care of yourselves if you find yourself activated. There are a few pictures on this slide. So I'm going to start by talking about the first um, picture on the top. So embedding restorative justice is just one of the ways that we can transform our culture that glorifies the carceral system. So as many of us know, the carceral system is disproportionately impacting survivors of color and contributes to the mass incarceration of Black and Brown folks. And I'd be really remiss if I didn't acknowledge the recent California legislation, like how we talked about bubbles earlier. I think a lot of folks who live in California feel the sense of security in the California bubble, but recently, we see that one of the proposed amendments to the Constitution to prohibit slavery and involuntary servitude as a form of punishment of crime was rejected by a majority of the voters. So it's evident that there's this deep-rooted perception of people who are incarcerated, an idea of what a person who commits crime looks like and what they're deserving of. And so again, this image at the top left corner will show that as of the time that I sent in this slide to the partnership, I believe it's like 98% voters now, and there's not been much that has changed. But the image will show that 88% reporting of the ballots to this proposal to prohibit slavery and involuntary servitude as punishment for crime, with 53% votes for no and 46 for yes, indicating that California mostly is in favor of slavery as a punishment for crime. That is bananas, y'all. Um, and I also think it's really important to talk about inconsistencies of law for specifically Black survivors of domestic violence. So at the center, you'll see a picture of two folks. The person on the right is the person who murdered Trayvon Martin. Just for background context, maybe like a refresher for folks. Um, George Zimmerman was acquitted on the basis of the stand your ground law in Florida, which basically indicates that if someone feels like they were in fear of their life or safety, that they can commit murder in self-defense. And so he was acquitted. And the person on the left is a woman named Marissa Alexander. She was experiencing DV in her home or in a home and was experiencing DV and was in fear of her safety. And her husband was home and making Marissa Alexander fear for her safety. And so she fired warning shots into, believe, into the roof of the building. And Marissa Alexander did not receive the same amount of, I don't know if you want to call it grace or same protections under this stand your ground law in Florida. She was incarcerated, um, which I think illustrates, again, the inconsistencies of law for Black survivors of domestic violence. The image at the bottom left is a picture of Toronto Burke. who coined the hashtag Me Too, but was not credited until much later. And so minoritized communities, especially Black women, are often neglected in legislative protections of gender and power-based harm. Um, and I think, again, this just really illustrates, I'm hearing things in the background. Sorry. I get hella distracted. So again, I think it's really important for us to be really mindful and aware of the bubble that we exist in that tells us what it means to be held accountable for actions, right? I notice I haven't been neglecting the chat, so I'm going to take a moment to kind of look through things. Um,
You've been
is it
getting a lot of reactions to your content.
LOL? Love it. Um, Hold on. Thank you. I'm just taking a moment because I have ADHD, y'all, and so I get very distracted. Thank you. It's about yes. Yeah, right. And there was also just like another measure that was passed in California that basically increased like punishment for folks engaging in like certain level of theft or I believe drug related topics. So again, this really carceral mass incarceration based legislation. Okay, thanks y'all for your patience. Okay, so I just want to give a little brief summary of the restorative justice modalities. So I like to start in the center because, again, it's really important that we're laying out the foundation for engaging in the other restorative justice modalities. So first is the community building, which can be a community building circle, welcoming circles. So if someone comes into our community, how are we welcoming them into the space? Talking circles, debriefing sessions, action planning circles, event planning circles, consent circles, like naming what our boundaries are. All of these things are that community building. It lays that kind of framework, these community agreements that we have in our communities. And then if harm were to happen, this would lead to like a restorative response or to conflict and harm. So these can be restorative conversations, restorative community conferences, peace building circles, harm circles, accountability circles. So these are the circles that happen again this is typically what we think of when we hear restorative justice is the people that were impacted meeting and addressing the harm that happened. But that can't necessarily happen before we have our community building. We need to establish this framework to name this is why there was a breach in our community agreements. And then we have our reentry circles, which can be exit circles. So indicating like this is what our community has deemed is going to be the appropriate response for for this person to temporarily be moved from our community to have the opportunity to relearn and to grow and then potentially to reintegrate. So having a reentry circle after this person has essentially worked on whatever this person needed to do to heal also, like this dual mutual healing process that needs to happen. Circles of support and accountability. And so what is really cool is that it conveniently matches well, first off, again, circling community building. We want to start here. So this is kind of like what the rest of the presentation is going to focus on is that community building aspect. Is again that we can use these restorative justice modalities to mirror the different levels of prevention and how we can implement that or implement RJ into our programs. Isn't this cute? So for example, when we think about and we want to uplift primary prevention, we can do this in a way where we are doing that community building, that value setting, peer education, workshops, trainings, events, RJ trainings. These are the things that we can use to give the tools to our community to be able to engage in restorative justice processes so that if that community foundation is being set, it lowers the likelihood of harm happening. We know that harm is inevitable. Also, we know that we can reduce harm that happens in our communities. And so again, it just mirrors it also when we think about secondary prevention through like our advocacy services, alternative resolution processes. So what are some of the I guess policies around what is an alternative resolution process? Is restorative justice implemented in that process? Having again RJ trainings and circles, and then our tertiary prevention, counseling and therapy, holistic healing, which is there for the person that caused harm and the person that experienced harm. I know that oftentimes um, resources aren't necessarily given to folks who cause harm. And so being really mindful of like, why is that the case? Is that something that we can kind of work towards? And thinking about having circles for support and accountability, vicarious trauma release, social norms campaigns, RJ circles, right? RJ circles kind of like are involved in every single level of the levels of prevention. Okay. So next, I'm going to talk about the different elements of a circle for maybe folks that are unfamiliar with kind of the different elements that exist within a circle. So I'll start off by talking about the things that are like on the right. I'm going to kind of jump around a little bit. So the first is the centerpiece. So this is essentially just what exists in the circle that helps bring grounding, that helps people feel that support and that intention into the space. Sometimes people will light candles, they'll put crystals, what maybe putting something that is meaningful to the space if folks feel a lot of community around certain like cultural identities, including those things into the circle to help again bring some focus and energy and mindful intention into the space. There's also the talking piece. So this could be, it doesn't have to be like people often use like the metaphor like a stick to pass around a stick as being the talking piece. The talking piece can be anything that provides meaning. And it just essentially is kind of a tool, a symbol for people to be aware of, okay, this person is speaking. And so just kind of bringing mindfulness into making sure that only one person is speaking at a time. It reduces the disruption, people dominating a space. I know I myself am an extrovert. Sometimes I take up hella space. So having a talking piece will kind of mitigate people kind of talking over each other and whatnot. Okay, I'm gonna jump in now to the intro to the circle. Oh, actually, no, I won't. I'm gonna still stick with the right side of things. So the values and guidelines. So these are what help create that foundation and structure for how we're engaging in community. So this is the community agreements that we're setting. These are the values that we want to bring into the space. This is emphasizing how we are going to engage in accountability with each other. So these are the three kind of key components of a circle. And so the more logistical components are on the left, starting with the intro to the circle. So providing introductions, meeting each other, making sure that we're naming our pronouns, just making sure that we're aware of who is in the space. Um, Creating expectations, setting the like, why are we here in this moment? And then it also has a check-in question, typically to kind of like bring some lighthearted energy, which isn't necessarily like it's important to bring into obviously for community building circles, but it's also important to bring into conflict resolution circles as well. So taking a temperature, making sure that people feel that community in the space, and then some icebreakers to bring trust and to bring humor. Because these topics can often feel really activating and really tricky and really complex and can make us feel a lot of negative energy. So we want to bring as much positive energy into the space as possible. And then going into the guiding questions. So these are kind of like what ground us into like the focus of what the topic is going to be. So it helps us focus into the conversation. It moves the conversation along. Gives a little bit of structure. That way, because again, a lot of emotions and a lot of feelings are coming in. A lot of people are feeling a lot of things. And so again, it just gives us the ability to go back on track. And then there's the closing, which gives folks a time to reflect, to appreciate, to prepare what's going to happen for uh the next part. Is it going to be another or like a continuation of the community building? Are we ready to go on to the conflict resolution process? It gives us that moment to repair and prepare and reflect. So I want us to practice. So this is our check-in question, which is the part of the intro to the circle. And I invite you to participate as much as you are willing and able. But I want to ask folks, what does accountability mean for you all? And feel free to write into the chat.
Not just saying you're sorry, but valuing forgiveness and
Mm,
how that person actually takes your apology.
mm. Yeah, so not just say like oftentimes we just say sorry because we want to alleviate feelings. We're trying to preserve a level of like feeling, or even sometimes people will just say, "Oh, that's valid," but not really like understand why it's valid. So kind of just saying things to say things and not really understanding the true meaning. So maybe accountability is understanding why the harm has happened.
Well,
Um,
for me, it's more like I would take accountability, admitting that I was in the wrong somehow.
mm, yeah, I love that, Helen, because I think sometimes too, when we think about accountability, I feel like especially in this field, is that accountability means to a lot of people, what are other people accountable for, and not necessarily what are we accountable for. So kind of like it's a mutual process. Accountability is all of us being accountable with each other. Love that. Um, I see in the chat someone said acknowledging what you have said or done. Um, Acknowledging and learning from the harm that has been caused, that you have caused, or that we have caused, having the opportunity to make an account of what happened, share your story, and take steps to make things right. Yeah, so kind of not just the acknowledgement, but also what am I doing now to remedy the harm that had happened? Taking the time to understand other people's perspectives, right? Acknowledging and understanding the full impact of the harm, co-creating how to move forward with repair. Yeah, I love that co-creation component. Acknowledgement of wrongdoing and providing a solution on how to move forward. Exactly. Mhm. Yeah, and I love someone Amy wrote, regardless of intention, having that accountability. Again, intention matters and it's important and it's valuable. It provides context, but it doesn't do anything. It doesn't mean that the harm that happened didn't happen. Um, yeah, I'm seeing a lot of beautiful things in the chat, y'all. Um, I see someone saying that accountability has also become a buzzword. And I think to me, it means doing the inner work to unpacking why harm happened in the first place. Yeah. And I think that I'm going to play this video in just a sec too, is that I keep touching my mouth and I realize I got to stop doing that. I'm sorry. Um, but yeah, accountability is also thinking about the work that we do that how do I word this? Like to process our inner child. Accountability is us being accountable to what our inner child has experienced and what harms and needs that inner child has. And what are we meeting? How are we meeting those needs in adulthood? And sometimes it's in a way that is harmful. And we need to do that healing work for ourselves so that we don't continue to cause harm. Um, Awareness of actions, the others feeling. Yes, yes. Self-awareness, ability to model. Love all of these. All right. Thank you, y'all, for engaging in this check-in question. We're engaging in community building together. So I'm going to play this video that I love that's from a couple of really great folks that do restorative and transformative justice work. So I'm going to play this video for you all, and then we'll kind of chat more about it in a bit.
Can you
I
make
think my,
sure when you play the video that closed captions are enabled?
yes.
Thank you so much.
Existing in a relationship.
I don't know if I should
With
put
the
auto-generated. What's better?
I don't know.
I'm gonna say auto-generated. No, I'm gonna say English.
Yeah,
Hopefully that works. Okay.
thank you.
When I think about accountability, I think people often talk about holding someone else accountable, but I feel like it really starts with holding yourself accountable. And so when I think about what that actually means, it is really about thinking about your choices, thinking about the options that you have, your desires and your drives, your values, and being aware of your agency within those different competing things, recognizing your ability to make choices that align or having made choices that didn't align with your values, and then figuring out what it takes to address any impact on yourself or on others based on those choices.
Yeah, I would say that at bare minimum, it's not denial, right? It's not telling someone that their experience didn't happen. It's not deflecting your responsibility. So, at minimum, just accepting that something happened that you were part of and contributed to. And then, kind of, ideally, you would get to a space where you can identify your agency and the choices that you made that led to an outcome that may have harmed someone.
I think as consent educators, we find that there always is a choice, even if people feel like there isn't a choice, and there's a degree of owning that power and identifying, even just imagining the ways that you could create choices in situations. Because often people deflect accountability by feeling like they didn't have any ability to do something different.
Accountability has to become, I love this idea that it has to become a norm, a cultural, social norm. Like it should be like we're going in the car with my kids and I'm like, did you put your seatbelt on? How are you feeling today? Are you happy or sad? Is there anything you need to be responsible for today? Like, right? Like we know about the seatbelt campaign and what it did. What the accountability campaign can do the same thing. And the reality is that it's true. It's like so freaking hard to do. It's the hardest thing to do because it requires so much self-reflection and dealing with my shame and, oh my God, did I do something wrong? It requires that we deal with the fact that we don't come from a culture that is socialized to care about each other. We haven't developed, we have let supremacy and being right and capitalism and patriarchy create the divisions of our otherness, right? We have to like hold those things, right? It requires that we begin a culture of coming from empathy, from listening, from being socialized to care.
I'm going to play another part of this video. So, patience. Okay.
Existing in a relationship.
When I think
I love that I gave myself timestamps. Okay. Captions. They're on. Cool.
It begins with someone being like, yeah, I did that. You're right, I did that. I don't want it to be true that I did that, but I did that. And then I think it's a grappling with what does it mean that I did that? And really listening to the harm that's been caused, which often, I think often we kind of think of that as just coming from the survivor, but often it's coming from people who are around the survivor. Like I can think of a process I'm in where the survivor's been harmed a lot, but I'm also at a point where I'm like, I have some things to say too about how this has affected me as someone who's part of this community, right? I think of it as a willingness to sit and listen to the truths of the harm that's been caused and to really sit with them and think about it and journal about it and meditate on it and really be like curious about it and work through all the levels of shame and self-hatred and really dig to like, okay, so what's the core? Like, where did that come from? Like, what were the conditions and the systems that made me make that choice, And I think that's something that can be done on the person who caused harm's own. I think it's also really held by community stuff. I think, like, I'm thinking about like different intersections of disability and neurodivergence and harm. And I'll name myself, like, I'm someone who's newly, grasping being on the disassociation spectrum and having parts of me that broke off through trauma when I was younger. And I'm in conversation with like a few people who have similar experiences of neurodiversity where I'm like, okay, so that angry 10-year-old part of me that sometimes screams, I hate you, at somebody. Okay, that's not adult me, but that's still me. How do I sit with that part of myself and be like, what does that part need? So maybe they don't do that in the same way, but they're still getting their needs met, And I think that there's actually, this might be going like really far afield for some folks, but I think that actually that's something, that's a principle or a strategy that could work even for people whose harm isn't coming from their neurodivergence or isn't intersecting with it, around like, what need were you getting met by causing harm? Like, what does that need in order for you not to be causing harm in order to get that need met? I'll also say, like, I think
All right, pause the video there. Yeah, so they described what I tried to, but way better. Any thoughts? I also see a lot of activation in the chat too. What's really resonating for folks? I also put the link to the video in the chat.
I'd like to share some of my thoughts that I'm having.
Yeah.
So when I'm thinking of accountability, at least from my own journey, is kind of like feelings and emotions. You could tell someone or someone could know what being accountable is, but I also think back as to what are the steps to actually get there? Because we could tell someone you need to be accountable and they could be well aware of what accountability looks like. But sometimes, what is the first step of actually being able to get there? And I know in the chat, I was seeing some conversations about being able to do the inner growth, being able to look inwards and look outwards. And I think that sometimes that's what's missing because we could say that a person needs to be accountable and a person is aware of being accountable. But as a person who works with people who have caused harm, I think of, well, how do I teach you in a way that is beneficial for you specifically? Because accountability also doesn't look the same to everyone, and it doesn't feel the same to everyone.
Right. Yeah, and I think something that's sticking out too is, and this is something that I think gets addressed in the video as well. That so hopefully I describe it in a way that makes sense. But um, I think sometimes we have this strong hope that we want the person that caused harm to know what they did was wrong, say that what they did was wrong, work on a process. Sometimes it can't get there. In order to engage in restorative justice, for example, both parties or all the parties need to want to engage. You can't have a restorative justice process when people don't want to engage in the process or are reluctant or are not or are apprehensive about it. That's not to say though that any sort of accountability work that the person that experienced harm is doing their own healing journey, their own community building with that support that also experienced that harm, that is still accountability. That doesn't we shouldn't or don't need to have that fulfilling moment of the person that caused harm to admit what they did was wrong. It doesn't remove or take away that accountability and healing that someone else is experiencing. Yeah, thanks for sharing. Any other thoughts? Yeah, someone wrote into the chat. The one that I've heard is compassion without accountability is collusion. Accountability without compassion is domination. Yeah. Yeah. Accountability isn't just saying, okay, fine, I did it. It's where's the meaning behind it? Again, where's the naming this is why what I did was wrong. Not just, oh, I can acknowledge that I did something wrong, but like, why was it wrong? What were the impacts that the person had over a person, an individual, a community, anything like that? Anyone else? I see someone say, did you just say we shouldn't need the person who caused harm, I think you mean harm, to admit it to have accountability? Kind of. I think the person that experienced the harm knows what happened. They know the harm that has happened. Just because someone doesn't admit to that harm doesn't mean the harm didn't happen. We don't need someone to say that they caused harm in order for us to know that harm has actually happened. There is still that accountability in that in what we do, there's still a process that we can do internally with our community that is still valid. That's what I'm trying to say. Does that make sense? Okay. Cool. Thanks, y'all. Okay, let's move on. Okay, so we have all seen or probably been a part of developing community agreements. But what I've noticed too is that oftentimes people do community agreements, and I feel like just to check a box and to say that we've done it, but really don't do anything with them afterwards. And so I think this takes a lot of intentional process to truly do them and invest in bringing them to our spaces, and also including a component on accountability in that space. Because when we're in community, when we're in team meetings, someone's bound to cause harm in some way or another. And I know I'm using the term harm loosely, but maybe like I'll just start saying like using discomfort or causing discomfort among colleagues. And there has or should also be embedded into our community agreements what to do when those discomforts inevitably come up. How are we going to address them? Are we going to do it publicly? Are we going to do it individually? Is there a anonymous form or survey that we can fill out and look to before we start our meetings to see what folks are feeling, or if something made folks experience discomfort? We gotta really be intentional about bringing these things, not just doing them to say we did them, but to actually continue to embed them into our everyday meetings, events, anything like that. So I'll go through them just because I think they're of value, and I think it can be helpful for some folks to maybe start thinking about how they want to embed community agreements in their spaces. So having confidentiality, and that's a weird term because sometimes we aren't confidential employees, and so I know that term can be loose or not loose, but can feel rigid. But is this a space where we can take what we get or be authentic in a space? Are we able to be our authentic selves when we engage in this space? So is what I essentially mean here. Respecting the talking piece. So making sure that we're practicing in meetings that we're not just talking to talk. Should we have a structure where one person goes, then the next person goes, and going in a circle so that every single person has the opportunity to speak or be able to pass? Just thinking about should we form or conduct our meetings in a different way, potentially? Listen from our heart, speak from our heart. So again, just really honoring our vulnerability and honesty in a space, which can be hard. Being present and engaged as we can be sometimes, and this is a really white supremacist culture where we think that if people are fidgeting, like in meetings now, I embroider. In meetings I embroider, and to some that might be like, oh well, you're being disrespectful, you're not paying attention. That is how, because of my ADHD, I need to center myself. And so being really accessible to what the needs are of individuals to be grounded and to be present in a space. So being really flexible on what that means for other people too. Ouch and oops. So this is a really cute one that I have practiced in the past, where if something that is said that maybe causes discomfort, maybe feels a little icky, we can say ouch, to indicate that like, hey, something was said, something was done, this is a decision that is causing some sort of discomfort. And then the person that is initiating that type of like conduct can be like, oops, as I hear you. I understand that there's something that we need to talk about. Maybe it doesn't need to get talked about in that moment. Maybe it does, depending on our community agreements, but it gives that acknowledgement that we need to talk about something. Some others, take space, make space. We don't necessarily need to have this one if we are honoring the talking piece. But again, if like maybe there's someone who's a little bit more extroverted, to make space, I always count to 5 Mississippis before I share
Para hacer
again, just to
espacio
give
siempre
folks the
cuento a 5
opportunity to have that
Mississippis
courage
para
to
darle la
engage
oportunidad a la gente de que
before
tenga el
we start.
coraje de volver a compartir
Recognizing
espacio,
impact versus
reconociendo
intent.
el
Again, we
impacto
talked about
versus
this
intención.
a few times in the
Hablamos de
presentation.
eso varias veces en la
Noticing power
presentación.
dynamics,
Dense cuenta aquí
acknowledging and
en
honoring
dinámicas
power
de poder
dynamics.
y
Even
honrar a
when
las
we try our
dinámicas
best
de poder, aun
to
cuando intentamos lo
mitigate
mejor
feelings of
para
discomfort because
mitigar
of power dynamics, they're just inherently
las
going to exist
sensaciones
and be
de
present sometimes.
incomodidad.
But what are we
Excuse
doing?
me one moment, Andrew. I think there's I am hearing Spanish interpretation, the English channel. Is anyone else having that as well? No? Okay, then it's just a me problem. Oh, yes. Okay. Oh, I think we just had that switched. All right. Thank you, Thomas. All right. Sorry. Go ahead, Andrew.
Okay, thank you. So we want to be super mindful and intentional about what power dynamics are we bringing into a space, and what are we doing to mitigate those feelings that might make people feel like they can't be authentic, or share what they need to share. Using I statements, speaking from your own experiences other than generalizing. So instead of saying, you're problematic, you are racist, you are homophobic, or blah, 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 we can say, hey, this experience or this word, this framing um, feels icky to me. Here's why this word brings up a lot of negative feelings for me. That way someone could have a really productive conversation. Because someone hears like you're racist, you're problematic, automatically we can't engage in a conversation anymore because someone's gonna have a defensive response. And then taking the learner stance. We're all perpetually learning. Even before doing this presentation, I think I, yeah, just experience, I feel like a lot of us can experience a lot of imposter syndrome because we are perpetually learners. We're always learning in just because we are a director in a space, just because we're the executive director in a space or we're a manager in a space does not mean we know everything. Um, it just means that we got the position because we were deserving of a position, and it doesn't mean that we know absolutely everything. We're all perpetually learning. Okay. Just a couple of examples. I'm not going to read every single value, but just some examples of some values that we want to bring into a space. This could be another check-in question to say, oh, let's build these community agreements together. Can everyone come in with 2 community agreements and 3 values that we want to make sure are foundational to this community? I love SpongeBob, and so I had to find any excuse to include SpongeBob into my slides. And so this is just to give a visualization of what a restorative justice circle could look like. So basically, it's just a bunch of SpongeBob characters in a circle, and in the middle is a black oval type of shape that include the words storytelling, recognition, accountability, and support. Which just basically indicate that a restorative or a community building circle is allowing us to be able to provide our anecdotes, to provide our any sort of like our narratives that encompass who we are, to bring our authenticity and vulnerability into a space, to build support within the community, mutual support, recognition of our lived histories and our ancestral histories, and have that process for accountability. And so all of these SpongeBob characters are in a circle, and there is one character, Sandy Cheeks, who is a squirrel wearing a scuba diving outfit, who is holding a Squishmallow pillow, and that is the talking piece. So we can see from this slide that Sandy has the floor and is sharing her contributions to the space. Maybe this is during the community agreement section. Maybe this is during the value setting section. Maybe this is the check-in question. But this is essentially how it would go. It could go clockwise, counterclockwise, but then Sandy would pass the Squishmallow to the person who is next to speak. Okay. So we're going to engage in one last activity before we wrap up, which will be the guiding question. So again, if you recall, I mentioned that the guiding question is essentially what is the foundational part or the big part of the conversation. This is where a lot of the energy is going into surrounding, setting the foundation so we can engage with the guiding question. So for this guiding question, I'd like for us to participate in again, another little reflective activity together. So I got this from the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective. I will put the link into the chat for folks to access that worksheet. Oh, that is not the, there it is. Is it this? Yes. Okay. So in the chat, you'll see a link. If you just scroll down a little bit, you'll be able to find the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective mapping worksheet. You can download it through clicking the link. And so as we do this activity, I kind of want to give a little bit of context. So some of you might recall, everyone's gonna recall, we were in a global pandemic and we had some sort of like safety mechanism in place called pods, where we would have our pods where we can hang around with community, because for extroverts like me, that was like the most miserable time of my life, not being able to be in community. But we can have pockets of people that are our safe community where we can just engage in. And so, yes, during the quarantine, yeah, the pandemic is still going on. Yes, thank you for that reality. And um, these pods we can think of also in terms of multiple areas of our life. These people that we feel security or safety with. And so I want you to find or think about those people. You can think about it in any context. You could think about your work pod, your teen pod. You can have your friend pod, your family pod. Just write down some of the people in your community that you feel that safety or security around. I'll give folks like 3 minutes to do this. They can use the worksheet, use a mental exercise to engage. Write it down on like a separate piece of paper. Okay. No worries if you're still doing that thought exercise. Just going to continue on. And obviously you have access to these things, so you can do them or continue to do them after the session or during or after. Okay, so why I really like this activity is I think sometimes it helps us have tangible materials to see in order to get us to visualize what sort of resources we have and what community members that we have in our surrounding community to help us keep ourselves accountable. And what I like to say too is that I know that we probably have this assumption, or we want to know or think that these important people in our communities at work, these trusted or safe people at work, or our friends or our family members would hold us accountable if we say something wrong or problematic. But do they know that? Do these people really has there been a conversation with these trusted people in our community around, hey, has there been a conversation like, hey, if I say something wrong or something hurtful, if I say something racist or if I say something problematic, I would like for you to let me know because I trust you that you would approach it in a way that is meaningful and productive and caring and compassionate. Because I think for a lot of people, maybe we don't know. Like if we haven't had this conversation, maybe some of us do feel like we can do that, but other folks might not feel that like it's that accessible. So I would encourage you all to finish this activity and to think about the people that we have that we deem as safe or trusted people to say, hey, I did this activity and I feel like you're someone that I truly trust to hold me accountable when I do something wrong. Um, would you mind letting me know if I do cause harm or if I do say something that made you uncomfortable or made someone else uncomfortable? I want you to let me know because then it opens up that door and it builds that foundation for us to have these conversations in a more accessible way. If we haven't had these conversations before, it could feel really awkward or uncomfortable to say something to someone. Um, Even though we might think, oh, I would definitely say something to this person if they say something wrong. And then the thing happens and we're like, oh, I don't know how to approach it. But if we have this conversation ahead of time, it can feel easier because that foundation, that a community agreement has already been established. And so I encourage you all to have these conversations and be really transparent. It can make having those hard conversations a lot less intimidating. Um, yeah, and just gives us the ability to be more in community with each other. All right. So now we're at the reflection section, meaning we're at the part where we kind of close. We reflect on things that we've learned. We think about how can we include a restorative practice framework in our community, in our jobs, in our community programs, in our outreaches, in our peer educations, in our prevention education workshops and whatnot. We can think about how we can start with community building and then work towards how are we going to engage now in the conflict resolution? How are we going to engage in that reentry component modality? So I appreciate you all taking the time to chat with me and to be in community. And if you have any questions, I think we have some time. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That was amazing. Does anyone have anything they want to share or some questions? Maybe folks are just digesting all the information. So I'll give a couple announcements. This was wonderful. Thank you again. We're so lucky when we can have a guest speaker such as Andrew. Very grateful to our interpreters for being here as well. I'm going to put in the chat some upcoming events. We have a webinar tomorrow. We have our Economic Equity in Action Forum in December, Bridging Gaps, Building Futures. And we have our Economic Justice Peer Learning Circle also in December. So those are some of our upcoming events. Oh, yes, go ahead, Michelle. I just saw a hand raised.
Yes, that was me. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, Andrew. Thank you for your presentation today. I'm interested in learning more about spaces that may be carrying these conversations further around restorative justice and folks who cause harm. And if there's any conversations being had about social norms change around that subject matter. And if you have any information, if you could share it with us or place it in the chat. And also, lastly, could you share your contact information so we may further discuss at a later time?
Definitely. Yeah, I put my email in the chat. That's my personal email. Feel free to reach out. And as for, oh, that's a great question. I know that there actually is a lot of work that's being done on a couple like college campuses that are doing a lot of great work. There's a lot of I mean, we talk about there's like a lot of prisons also that are doing the work. I always feel weird about like just prisons in general, but I mean it's important to have uh include that they're doing work in terms of having restorative justice processes there. The Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective is one of the ones that I like to uplift a lot because I think there's just a lot of amazing work doing that they're doing up there. The Bay Area in general is doing a lot of great restorative justice and transformative justice work. But yeah, I can definitely share some of those specific organizations if folks are interested too.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Also, just because I've been getting this question in the chat, we will post the recording and any of the links and the presentation all go on in our resource library. I'm hoping to do that later today, might be tomorrow, might be Monday, but in the next few days, just check back on our resource library. We post our presentations there. And Michelle from our comms team, thanks for putting that in. We are looking for our new executive director. Paul Castro has been an amazing interim, but he eventually wants to not be interim forever. And so we are looking to hire. So please get in those applications by December 4th. Anyone else? We can always give, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll second what Deshelle said. If there's information that could be provided to us, I would also appreciate that. But I'm also looking for information, if possible, if you have any resources of, so I'm specifically looking at women, and it would be women who are possibly women who are incarcerated for the crimes of an abusive partner. And they have also experienced some type of like domestic violence or some type of family violence that has occurred to them. I want to know if there's any awareness on this issue, if there's any resources or any programs that are currently working with this population.
Yeah. So, okay. I wasn't sure if you were gonna answer, Kimmy. I'm not super 100% familiar. I can take a look. But yeah, a lot of my specific programs or like work has been in higher ed.
I'll jump in real quick. I did just put a link in for Survived and Punished, which is a organization in California that specifically looks at incarcerated folks, mostly female identifying, who are incarcerated because of usually violence that they have had to enact in self-defense against someone who has perpetrated harm towards them. So there's a lot of great information on that website. I just support their work, but I don't know quite as much about it, but they'd be a great place to start. I'm also seeing in the chat, a lot of appreciations for Andrew and our interpretation. Resources on working particularly with queer populations in IPV. Yes, the National Institute is fantastic. I love the folks there. New helpline for people who are causing harm in their intimate partner relationship. A call for change. I hadn't heard of that. Thank you, Camilla. And then, oh, and Marissa Alexander got lots of support from Survived and Punished. One of the people that Andrew brought up earlier. Yes.
Thanks, y'all. I appreciate y'all.
But we can let everyone go. I'll stop the recording.